On the 2nd of July 1942, the United States Joint Chiefs of Staff ordered Allied forces in the Pacific to mount a limited offensive to halt the Japanese advance toward the line of communications from the United States to Australia and New Zealand. At the same time, the United States was committed to a program for building up forces in Great Britain to launch an offensive in Europe in 1942 or 1943. There were then available so few warships, transports, and cargo ships, so few trained troops, so few weapons and supplies that any offensive in the Pacific, for which the United States would have to provide most of the forces, would necessarily be limited in scale. Yet it was essential to halt the Japanese, who were then moving ever nearer to the flank of the tenuous line of communications. The Joint Chiefs' decision of July 2nd led to the long, grim struggle for the possession of Guadalcanal, an island in the remote British Solomon Islands Protectorate, which was not specifically named in the orders dispatched by the Joint Chiefs. The decision to mount a limited offensive in the Pacific was a logical corollary to earlier strategic decisions. The highest political and military authorities of the United States and Great Britain had decided to defeat Germany before concentrating on Japan. The world had been divided into spheres of primary military responsibility, and the United States assumed responsibility for directing the war in the Pacific. Subject to decisions of the United States-British Combined Chiefs of Staff on global strategy, the strategic direction of the war in the Pacific was assigned to the United States Joint Chiefs of Staff. In March 1942, they had agreed to assemble forces in Britain during that year to mount an offensive in Europe at the earliest possible moment. For the time being, Allied strategy in the Pacific was to be limited to containing the Japanese with the forces then committed or allotted. Concentration against Germany, it was believed, would give the most effective support to the Soviet Union and keep the forces in the British Isles from being inactive, while containment of the Japanese would save Australia and New Zealand from enemy conquest. The two dominions, important to the Allies as sources of supply, as essential economic and political units of the British Commonwealth of Nations, and in the future to become bases for offensive operations, would have to be held. The implications of this decision were clear. If Australia and New Zealand were to be held, then the line of communications from the United States to those dominions would have to be held. Forces to defend the Allied bases along the line, including New Caledonia, the Fijis, and Samoa, had already been sent overseas. There were not enough ships, troops, weapons, or supplies, however, to develop each base into an impregnable fortress. The bases were designed to be mutually supporting, and each island had been allotted forces sufficient to hold off an attacking enemy, long enough to permit air and naval striking forces to reach the threatened position from adjacent bases, including the Hawaiian Islands and Australia. For the conduct of operations in the Pacific, two separate commands, the Southwest Pacific Area and the Pacific Ocean areas, embracing almost the entire ocean and its land areas, were designated by the Joint Chiefs of Staff with the approval of the President on the 30th of March. The Southwest Pacific area included the Philippine Islands, the South China Sea, the Gulf of Siam, and the Netherlands East Indies, except Sumatra, the Solomon Islands, Australia, and the waters to the south. The post of Supreme Commander of Allied forces in this vast area was given to General Douglas MacArthur, Commander-in-Chief Southwest Pacific Area, who had just reached Australia from the Philippines. The even vaster Pacific Ocean areas included the remainder of the Pacific Ocean west of the North American continent, except for one area, the Southeast Pacific Area, the western boundary of which ran from the western Mexican-Guatemalan boundary southwest to the 11th parallel of north latitude to longitude no degrees west, and thence due south along the 110th meridian. The Pacific Ocean areas included three subordinate areas, the North, Central, and South Pacific areas. The North Pacific area included all the Pacific north of latitude 42 degrees north. The Central Pacific area, embracing the Hawaiian Islands, Christmas, Palmyra, Johnston, most of the Japanese-held Gilberts and the Japanese-held Marshalls, Carolines, Marianas, Formosa, in addition to most of the Japanese home islands, lay between the equator and latitude 42 degrees north. South of the equator, west of longitude 0 degrees west, and east of the southwest Pacific was the South Pacific area, which included thousands of islands and more than 1 million square miles of ocean. New Zealand, New Caledonia, and the New Hebrides, Santa Cruz, Fiji, Samoan, Tongan, Cook, and Society Islands all lay in the South Pacific. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief, United States Pacific Fleet, was appointed Commander-in-Chief of all Allied forces in the Pacific Ocean areas, except those forces responsible for the land defence of New Zealand, which were controlled by the New Zealand Chiefs of Staff. Admiral Nimitz, with headquarters at Pearl Harbor, was to command the Central and North Pacific areas directly, but was ordered to appoint a subordinate who would command the South Pacific area. Both General MacArthur and Admiral Nimitz were responsible to the Joint Chiefs of Staff in Washington. General George C. Marshall, Chief of Staff of the United States Army, acted as executive for the Joint Chiefs of Staff for the Southwest Pacific area. Admiral Ernest J. King, Commander-in-Chief, United States Fleet, was executive for the Joint Chiefs of Staff for the Pacific Ocean areas. The missions assigned to MacArthur and Nimitz were virtually the same. They were to hold those island positions between the United States and Australia, which were essential to the security of the line of communications and to the support of air, surface, and amphibious operations against the Japanese, to contain the Japanese within the Pacific, to support the defense of North America, to protect essential sea and air communications, and to prepare major amphibious offensives, the first of which were to be delivered from the South and Southwest Pacific areas. Each area was to support its neighbors' operations. When task forces from the Pacific Ocean areas operated beyond their boundaries, either the combined or the Joint Chiefs of Staff would coordinate their operations with those of other forces. The speed and breadth of the Japanese offensive, which opened on the 7th of December 1941, had rendered ineffective the Allied Organization of the Pacific, which preceded the establishment of the Pacific Ocean and Southwest Pacific areas. From December 1941 until May of the following year, the Japanese had been expanding their empire. They defeated the scanty Allied forces opposing them and established a perimeter of bases to guard their newly won gains. When Rabaul, a small town on Gazelle Peninsula on New Britain in the Bismarck Archipelago, fell on the 23rd of January 1942, the Japanese had gained a major objective. Rabaul lay just 1,170 nautical miles southeast of the Japanese bases in the Palau Islands and 640 miles south of Truk in the Carolines. Easily defended, Rabaul possessed the best harbor in the entire archipelago, as well as excellent sites for airfields. A key base for the Japanese effort to dominate both eastern New Guinea and the Solomon Islands, it was to be the focus of the Allied war effort in that area for 2 years. The coast of New Guinea lies 440 nautical miles southwest of Rabaul, and the centre of the north coast of Guadalcanal Island in the British Solomon Islands Protectorate is only 565 nautical miles southeast of Rabaul. Since Japanese bombers from Rabaul could easily attack both areas, the Japanese were well situated for a push to the south. They could cover their advance by constructing forward fighter plane bases as they advanced. No island in the New Guinea, New Britain, New Ireland, Solomons area lies beyond fighter plane range of its nearest neighbor. The Japanese could advance step by step along the island bases covered by aircraft throughout their entire advance. Even if the Japanese commanders had ventured to seize bases beyond the range of their aircraft, they probably could have done so easily, for only a handful of aircraft and Australian soldiers were defending the New Guinea Bismarck Solomons area. The Japanese, fortunately, elected to move southward cautiously and deliberately. After capturing Rabaul, the Japanese garrisoned the Duke of York Islands in St. George's Channel between New Britain and New Ireland. They also moved to New Ireland itself and built an air base at Kavieng, 130 nautical miles northwest of Rabaul. Having covered their rear, they began to move south in a series of amphibious advances, which, had they succeeded completely, would have encircled the Coral Sea. The first efforts were directed against New Guinea. The Japanese did not move into the Solomons until later. The Allied base at Port Moresby on the south coast of the Papuan Peninsula of New Guinea was their main objective. Instead of taking it at one blow in early 1942 and developing it before the Allies could retaliate, the Japanese moved gradually. They occupied Gasmata off the south coast of New Britain in February 1942, then crossed to New Guinea, and took Ley and Salamaua in March. They first moved into the Solomons in March 1942. On 13 March, naval landing and construction forces took Buka, the northernmost island in the Solomons, 170 nautical miles southeast of Rabaul, and built a fighter strip there. Additional forces began building fighter strips at Buin and nearby Kahili on the south coast of Bougainville, 270 nautical miles from Rabaul. Others were begun at Kieta on the east coast and in the Shortland Islands. The Japanese also assembled a carrier task force and an amphibious force at Truk to attack Port Moresby. A detachment of the amphibious force landed on Tulagi in the Solomons on the 3rd of May. The main body of the Japanese force, however, failed to capture Port Moresby. Intercepted by Allied naval and air forces in the Coral Sea in May, the Japanese lost one aircraft carrier and were forced to withdraw. Allied forces also struck at Tulagi during the Coral Sea engagement. The Japanese then turned their attention to Midway and the Aleutian Islands. Orders issued by Imperial General Headquarters during the opening phases of the Coral Sea battle had directed the Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet to cooperate with the Army in invading Midway and the Aleutians. These attacks were to be followed by invasions, in cooperation with the 17th Army, of strategic points around the New Caledonia, Fiji and Samoa Islands, and the destruction of important enemy bases to effect the isolation of Australia. In June, the Japanese obtained a foothold in the Aleutians, but their main effort at the same time against Midway did not succeed. 4 of their aircraft carriers were sunk off Midway, and the Japanese withdrew without attempting to land on the island. This engagement, so disastrous for the enemy, did much to restore the naval balance in the Pacific and enabled the Allies to take the initiative. On the 11th of July, Imperial General Headquarters cancelled the orders, which had called for invasions of Midway, New Caledonia, Fiji, and Samoa. But at Tulagi, the Japanese had already built a seaplane base, which had originally been designed to support the attack on Port Moresby. The tiny island of Tulagi, seat of government of the British Solomon Islands Protectorate, dominates Tulagi Harbour, the best ship anchorage in the southern Solomons, and lies 560 nautical miles from Espiritu Santo in the British-French condominium of the New Hebrides. Noumea in New Caledonia is 800 miles southeast of Tulagi, and the Fijis are 1,000 miles away. Even before the Japanese orders directing the attacks against New Caledonia, the Fijis, and Samoa were cancelled, the Japanese commander at Tulagi had reconnoitred the island of Guadalcanal, 20 miles away. Perhaps on his own initiative, he decided to build an airfield near the mouth of the Lunga River in the centre of the north coast. This airfield, which was intended to provide a base for 60 naval planes, was to have been completed by the 15th of August. If the Japanese intended to continue their advance, the next logical step would certainly have been a series of moves through the New Hebrides toward the Fijis, Samoa, and New Caledonia. The seaplane base at Tulagi and the airfield under construction on Guadalcanal did not yet directly threaten the Allied South Pacific air route, but they portended a serious threat. There was no unified Japanese command controlling operations in the eastern New Guinea Bismarck Solomons area. Rabaul was to become the site of separate Army and Navy commands, each of which was responsible to separate higher headquarters. The initial landings in the Solomons had been effected under naval command, but ground operations in the Solomons and eastern New Guinea later came under control of the 17th Army, headquarters of which were established at Rabaul in July 1942. Later in July, the headquarters of the Southeastern Fleet was also established at Rabaul. This fleet controlled the 8th Fleet, the 11th Air Fleet, and the 8th, 14th, 1st, and 7th Base Forces at Rabaul, New Ireland, Buin, and Leh, respectively. The Japanese advances into the Bismarcks, New Guinea, and the Solomons had generally not been strongly opposed, and the few Australian troops had been annihilated or driven out of the Bismarcks and Solomons. The Allies, fortunately, had been able to keep watch on the enemy's movements. The Australian government, long before World War II, had created the Coast Watching Service as an integral part of the Directorate of Naval Intelligence of the Royal Australian Navy. The Coast Watchers, most of whom were former planters and civil servants who had lived in the islands for years, remained behind the Japanese lines after the invasions, and radioed reports on the enemy's troop, ship, and plane movement to the Directorate of Naval Intelligence at Townsville, Australia. When the Japanese moved to Guadalcanal, coast watchers hidden in the mountains reported the fact to Allied headquarters in Australia. This information was transmitted to the Joint Chiefs of Staff in Washington on the 6th of July, 1942. But even before the Japanese were known to have begun their airstrip on Guadalcanal, and before Imperial General Headquarters cancelled the orders to invade New Caledonia, Samoa, and the Fijis, the Joint Chiefs of Staff had issued orders for the limited offensive in the area to protect the line of communications to Australia. With the Japanese threatening to cut the line of communications to Australia or to attack Australia directly, the American officers responsible for the conduct of the Pacific War had agreed that an offensive should be mounted to end the threat. Before the Joint Chiefs of Staff could issue orders for the attack, they had to settle serious problems regarding command and the employment of forces. As early as 8th May, after the Japanese defeat in the Coral Sea, General MacArthur was preparing plans for an offensive. He pointed out that the Japanese victories in the Philippines and Burma would free at least 2 infantry divisions and additional aircraft, and that the enemy forces in Malaya and the Netherlands East Indies might also be moved forward. Still able to move unhindered along interior lines of communication, the enemy could attack New Guinea and the line of communications between the United States and Australia. To prevent these attacks, MacArthur wished to take the offensive, but he desired that his naval forces first be strengthened by aircraft carriers, and that more planes and troops be added to his air and ground forces. At the same time, Admiral Nimitz was contemplating the possibility of attacking Tulagi in the Solomons, a project which found favour with Admiral King. Admiral Nimitz first suggested using a Marine Raider battalion for the attack, but Admiral King and Generals Marshall and MacArthur all agreed, on 1st of June, that 1 Raider battalion would be too small a landing force. General MacArthur's plans envisaged a larger operation than a raid. Believing that 1 Japanese regiment was then holding Tulagi but was not thoroughly dug in, and that 1 division was stationed at Rabaul, he desired to mount a large-scale offensive against the Solomons and New Britain. He suggested that as more troops became available, the South Pacific forces might profitably move farther forward into the Loyalty, Santa Cruz, and New Hebrides Islands. After the great Japanese defeat off Midway on the 3rd to 4th of June 1942, General MacArthur, on the 8th of June, again suggested taking the offensive at an early date, with the New Britain-New Ireland area as the objective. Available trained troops in the Southwest Pacific area then included the 32nd and 41st United States Infantry Divisions and the 7th Australian Division. These divisions, however, were not equipped or trained for amphibious operations. They could support an amphibious attack by moving ashore once a beachhead had been taken, but they could not take a beachhead themselves. The objectives of the offensive lay beyond range of United States fighter aircraft. Close air support would have to be provided by aircraft carriers, but none were assigned to the Southwest Pacific area. General MacArthur therefore requested that 1 trained amphibious division and a suitable naval task force be made available at the earliest possible date. If these forces seized the New Britain-New Ireland area, the Japanese would be forced back to Truk. At the same time, the Joint Chiefs of Staff were considering the possibility of persuading the British to use the Eastern Fleet against Timor, or against the Andaman and Nicobar Islands in the Bay of Bengal, in coordination with the offensive effort of the United States. General Marshall, who favored placing the prospective offensive under General MacArthur's command, explained his views to Admiral King on 12 June. He believed that an attack designed to retake eastern New Guinea and New Britain could be mounted in early July. If the attack succeeded, it might be followed by a raid on Truk. The 1st Marine Division, part of which was soon to land at Wellington, New Zealand, could make an initial amphibious attack against the Japanese positions. This division, plus 12 transports and 4 destroyer transports, could be assembled at Brisbane by the 5th of July. The 3 trained divisions in Australia could support and eventually relieve the Marine Division after adequate beachheads had been established and normal land warfare had begun. 106 heavy bombers, 138 medium bombers, 48 light bombers, and 371 fighters, to be assembled in Australia by the 1st of July, would provide land-based air support. Additional bombers could be dispatched from Hawaii. Army fighters and bombers could support attacks against Lae and Salamaua. Bombers could reach Rabaul, but the fighters, from their present basis in Australia and Port Moresby, could not fly that far. Aircraft carriers would therefore be required to provide fighter support, and other naval surface vessels would naturally be needed. Unity of command would be absolutely essential to make the operation a complete success. General Marshall had also directed General MacArthur to prepare tentative plans along these lines. The War Department and General MacArthur both believed that the operation, since it would take place in his area, should be conducted under General MacArthur's control. As the forces involved would be largely naval, the War Department suggested that a naval officer, under General MacArthur, be placed in command of the task force which would execute the operation. The Navy's ideas differed from those of the Army. Admiral King presented his views to General Marshall on the 25th of June. Regretting that the United States had not been able to attack the Japanese immediately after Midway, he thought that the offensive should be launched about the 1st of August by a task force under the control of Admiral Nimitz. The immediate objectives would be positions in the Solomons in the Southwest Pacific area and in the Santa Cruz Islands in the South Pacific area, 335 nautical miles east-southeast of Guadalcanal. The ultimate objectives would be the New Guinea-New Britain area. Admiral King believed that the force should include at least 2 aircraft carriers with accompanying cruisers and destroyers, the 1st Marine Division and transports of the South Pacific Amphibious Force, 5 Marine Air Squadrons, and the land-based planes from the South Pacific. The Southwest Pacific would furnish the task force with land-based aircraft, surface ships, and submarines. The permanent occupation of the Santa Cruz and other islands in the South Pacific area would be effected by the commander of that area, with forces to be designated later. The captured islands in the Solomons New Guinea area would be permanently occupied under General MacArthur's direction by troops moved forward from Australia on shipping provided by Admiral Nimitz. Admiral King wished General MacArthur's forces and elements of the British Eastern Fleet to conduct diversionary attacks against Timor in the Netherlands East Indies, at the same time that Admiral Nimitz's task force struck the Solomon and Santa Cruz Islands. He informed General MacArthur, Admiral Nimitz, and the South Pacific Area headquarters of his ideas. Admiral King's plans did not find favour in the War Department. Navy planners had been discussing the projected offensive with members of the Operations Division of the War Department General Staff, who were General Marshall's strategic advisors. The Army planners estimated that the Japanese ground forces in the target area included 2 brigades around Rabaul, about 1,000 Special Naval Landing Force troops at Lae and Salamaua, 2 companies on New Ireland, 1 battalion in the Admiralties, a small garrison on Bougainville, and a regiment in the Tulagi area. 126 aircraft, including bombers, fighters, and reconnaissance planes, were believed to be located in New Britain, New Ireland, New Guinea, and the Solomons. It was considered possible that 33 bombers on Timor would be used to reinforce Rabaul. Japanese naval strength in the target area included only small units, but strong forces were believed to be based at Truk. The Operations Division concluded that these forces were capable of attacking Port Moresby, the east coast of Australia, or New Caledonia, and could be expected to try to take Port Moresby, which was necessary as a base for operations against Northern Australia. Loss of Port Moresby would deprive the Allies of the only advanced base from which they could strike Lae, Salamaua, and Rabaul. If the Allies were to attack the Japanese at Rabaul, the enemy would be able to move troops from Tulagi and the Admiralties to Rabaul in 4 days, although no strong reinforcements could be sent to Rabaul in less than 3 weeks. Unless the Japanese air installations at Rabaul could be reduced by preparatory bombardment, the projected offensive would meet strong resistance from land-based planes. The seizure of Rabaul, followed by the seizure of eastern New Guinea, New Ireland, New Britain, and the Solomons, would deprive the Japanese of bases from which they could attack Australia and the Allied-held islands in the South Pacific, and advance the radius of Allied reconnaissance and air attack as far as Truk. Such a plan would require the 3 available infantry divisions and aircraft in Australia, as well as the 5 cruisers, 12 destroyers, and 30 submarines in the Southwest Pacific, in addition to the 1st Marine Division, 12 transports and cargo ships, and at least 2 aircraft carriers from the Pacific Ocean areas. The Navy's plan to attack and occupy Tulagi first and then move progressively against Rabaul would require a naval task force, an army garrison force, and additional land-based aircraft from Australia and Port Moresby, all under naval command. Neither plan could be executed before August, as the necessary shipping could not be assembled in time. The Operations Division concluded that a plan to take Rabaul first offered the greater promise of success, since it would provide for the maximum use of available forces and would strike directly at the primary objective. A quick stroke at Rabaul, the key Japanese base in the entire area, could be supported by land-based bombers, although aircraft carriers would have to provide fighter support. Once Rabaul fell, the Operations Division believed, the remaining Japanese positions in the area, isolated beyond their supply lines, would be rendered impotent. The Navy plan, on the other hand, involved a gradual move from Tulagi to Rabaul. The capture of Tulagi, an operation in which the Allied forces could be supported by long-range bombers, would not be difficult, but 2 factors would militate against the success of the Navy plan. First, further advances northward toward Rabaul would be subjected to continuous aerial bombardment, and, second, a step-by-step advance would warn the Japanese and permit them to reinforce Rabaul with air and ground forces before enough Allied strength could be mustered to strike directly at Rabaul. On the basis of these conclusions, the Operations Division recommended that Rabaul be attacked first, that the Navy provide the Marine Division and 12 transports and at least 2 carriers and supporting vessels, that the attack be launched as early as possible, and that the operation be under General MacArthur's command. The Army and Navy plans differed considerably, but the greatest obstacle to agreement between the services was the selection of a commander. Army planners reported to General Marshall that they would be able to resolve all differences with the Navy planners, except that of command. According to the Army point of view, unity of command would be essential since the offensive would involve not only the amphibious attack force and land-based aircraft, but also the movement and supply of the garrison forces and coordination with the Allies. Since the offensive would take place in General MacArthur's area, he should control it, and the tactical command of the attacking force should be in the hands of a naval officer. The Navy agreed that unity of command was essential, but feared that, if the high command were given to General MacArthur, he might dangerously expose the aircraft carriers by placing them in the waters between the Solomons and New Guinea within range of land-based aircraft. Tulagi would have to be reduced first to lessen the hazard to the carriers. Command of the attacking force, the Navy planners concluded, should go to Admiral Nimitz's subordinate, Vice Admiral Robert L. Gormley, the commander of the South Pacific Area and South Pacific Force. The Army planners recommended to General Marshall that he and Admiral King personally choose a commander for the invasion. Informed by General Marshall of the Navy's opposition to his plan, General MacArthur responded vigorously. The Navy, he asserted, had misunderstood his proposals. Rabaul was the ultimate objective, but direct attack upon it would be rendered impossible by the limited amount of land-based air support which could be brought to bear from present bases. His plans involved a progressive advance against the Solomons and New Guinea's north coast, to obtain airfields from which to support the final attacks against Rabaul and to cover the naval surface forces. He felt that only confusion would result if ground forces from the Pacific Ocean areas were employed inside the Southwest Pacific area under a naval command exercised from a distant headquarters, as the Navy had suggested. The Southwest Pacific headquarters was the logical agency to direct the offensive, for the necessary intelligence, reconnaissance and planning agencies were all in its area, and General MacArthur believed that he should command any large operation through his air, ground and surface commanders. Finally, he opposed the idea of trying to retake Timor at that time, on the ground that there were not enough air or naval forces in the area to support such an effort. An exchange of memoranda between General Marshall and Admiral King on the 26th of June failed to produce agreement. General Marshall opposed the plan to place the invading force under Admiral Nimitz's control. He sought to allay the Navy's fear for the safety of the aircraft carriers by suggesting that the Joint Chiefs of Staff could pass on the arrangements for the employment of naval forces, and he reiterated the argument that, since the ultimate objectives lay in General MacArthur's area, he should command. Admiral King, still unconvinced, felt that Admiral Nimitz should command. At the conclusion of the Amphibious phase, King suggested, General MacArthur could control further movements into the target area. The movements would be supported by the Pacific Fleet. South Pacific operations would be primarily amphibious and naval in character. As the nearest bomber base in Australia lay nearly 1,000 miles away from Tulagi, the Southwest Pacific area would be able to render little support at first. Admiral King therefore insisted on a naval commander, and he suggested that the Navy would begin operations immediately, even if Army forces in the Southwest Pacific area gave no support. At the same time, Admiral King, believing that the Army might delay its participation in the attack, directed Admiral Nimitz to proceed with preparations for an offensive in the Solomon and Santa Cruz Islands and to make recommendations regarding both the movement of Army aircraft from Hawaii and support by Southwest Pacific forces. Admiral Nimitz immediately began preparations, as did Admiral Gormley in the South Pacific. The commanding general of the 1st Marine Division, a part of which had just landed in Wellington, was ordered to prepare plans and load ships for an attack against the Solomon and Santa Cruz Islands. Admiral Nimitz requested of the Joint Chiefs that 8 Army B-17s and 13 Army B-26s be moved from Hawaii to New Caledonia, and the same number from Hawaii to the Fijis to be under his control. He also asked that the surface ships and all available submarines of the Southwest Pacific Naval Forces be made available to Admiral Gormley, and that long-range aircraft from the Southwest Pacific lend whatever support Gormley should recommend. The implications in Admiral King's belief that the Army might not fully participate disturbed General Marshall, for he believed that all available support should be given to the offensive regardless of the outcome of the command dispute, and he sent orders to that effect to General MacArthur. He decided to settle the disagreement by personal conferences with Admiral King. The two officers negotiated in person and in writing from 29th June until 2nd July. Admiral King suggested that Admiral Gormley command the offensive until the Tulagi operation was over, and that thereafter General MacArthur should control the advance toward Rabaul. The army had some objections, but opposed even more strongly an alternative proposal by Admiral King that Gormley command the operation directly under the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Admiral King's first compromise proposal was adopted. To prevent depleting General MacArthur's area of trained troops, General Marshall insisted that occupation forces for Tulagi be drawn from the South Pacific instead of from the Southwest Pacific area. By July 2nd, it seemed possible that 3 aircraft carriers instead of 2 could be provided, although the serious German threat to the British in the Middle East made the raid on Timor seem unlikely. On the 2nd of July 1942, General Marshall and Admiral King, having reached agreement on all questions at issue, signed the Joint Directive for Offensive Operations in the Southwest Pacific Area agreed on by the United States Chiefs of Staff. This directive ordered that an offensive be mounted at once. The ultimate object was the seizure of the New Britain, New Ireland, New Guinea area. The operation was divided into 3 tasks. Task 1 was the seizure and occupation of the Santa Cruz Islands, Tulagi, and adjacent positions, and would be under the command of an officer designated by Admiral Nimitz. General MacArthur was to attach the necessary naval reinforcements and land-based aircraft to the South Pacific forces and to interdict enemy air and naval activity west of the target area. The target date of Task 1 for planning purposes would be the 1st of August. Task 2, the seizure and occupation of the remainder of the Solomons, of Lae, Salamaua, and of the northwest coast of New Guinea, would be under General MacArthur's command, as would Task 3, the seizure and occupation of Rabaul and adjacent positions in the New Britain, New Ireland area. The composition of forces, the timing of the tasks, and the passage of command would be determined by the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The boundary between the Southwest Pacific and the South Pacific areas was to be moved west to longitude 159 degrees east on the 1st of August, a change which placed the entire Task 1 target area, Tulagi, Guadalcanal and Florida, as well as the Russells, Malaita and San Cristobal, in the South Pacific under Gormley, but left the remainder of the Solomons in the Southwest Pacific under MacArthur. Forces for all 3 tasks were to be drawn from the ground, air and naval forces then under General MacArthur, and from Marine Air Squadrons and land-based aircraft in the South Pacific, plus at least 2 aircraft carriers with accompanying cruisers and destroyers to support the South Pacific Amphibious Force, which included transports, cargo ships, and the 1st Marine Division. Army forces from the South Pacific were to be used to garrison Tulagi and the adjacent positions, while troops from General MacArthur's command would provide other necessary garrisons. Naval Task Force commanders would exercise direct command of the amphibious forces throughout the conduct of all 3 tasks. The Joint Chiefs of Staff reserved the power to withdraw United States fleet units upon the completion of any phase of the operation if the aircraft carriers were jeopardized, or if an emergency arose elsewhere in the Pacific. Admiral King dispatched orders to Pearl Harbor embodying the provisions of the Directive, and went to San Francisco to confer with Admiral Nimitz. General Marshall informed General MacArthur of the plan and told him that Admiral Gormley, who would command during Task 1, would visit Melbourne for conferences. Admiral King's orders of July 2nd did not actually initiate naval preparation for the offensive, for both Nimitz and Gormley had begun their preparations in June, when Admiral King had contemplated making the offensive an all-Navy operation. By the first week in July, Admiral Nimitz's plans were approaching completion. He decided that Admiral Gormley should exercise strategic control over the forces in the Task 1 operation. Vice Admiral Frank J. Fletcher would command, under Admiral Gormley, the entire seaborne invasion force. Designated as the Expeditionary Force, it was to be made up of aircraft carriers and other warships organized as the Air Support Force and the Amphibious Force consisting of warships, transports, and the troops who would make the landing. Rear Admiral Richmond K. Turner was to command the Amphibious Force of the Expeditionary Force. Fletcher and Turner were present at Pearl Harbor during the first days of July. Turner, by a previous appointment, was then on his way to the South Pacific to take command under Admiral Gormley of the South Pacific Amphibious Force. Nimitz, Fletcher, Turner and their staffs discussed the forthcoming invasion at this time. The Japanese were known to be building the airstrip on Guadalcanal, and at these conferences it was suggested that Guadalcanal be specified as an objective. This possibility was made known to Admiral Gormley on the 7th of July. Admiral Gormley had formally assumed his duties as commander of the South Pacific Area and South Pacific Force on the 19th of June, with headquarters at Auckland, New Zealand. He flew from Auckland to Melbourne on the 7th of July to confer with General MacArthur, as the Joint Chiefs had directed. The general and admiral discussed the directive and agreed on the obvious necessity for invading Guadalcanal as well as Tulagi. Their plans and recommendations, subject to change after Fletcher and Turner arrived in the South Pacific, were immediately radioed to the Joint Chiefs of Staff. MacArthur and Gormley strongly objected to the immediate launching of Task 1, which they defined as an orthodox landing in the Guadalcanal-Tulagi area. There were enough forces available for Task 1, they believed, but only one amphibious division had been assigned, and heavy casualties might render it incapable of engaging in all the subsequent invasions which were needed to carry out the remaining two tasks. Not enough ships to move all the necessary troops were available. A third major difficulty arose from the fact that the successful execution of Task 1 would require that the ships of the South Pacific Amphibious Force remain for perhaps 2 days in the Guadalcanal-Tulagi area, beyond range of Allied land-based aircraft and exposed to attacks by Japanese warships. Southwest Pacific aircraft were too few in number to prevent enemy air and surface forces from attacking the invasion force, and the aircraft carriers would be exposed to attacks by land-based aircraft. It would be difficult, they believed, for the attacking forces to surprise the enemy, whose patrol planes could cover the approaches to the target. In addition, the Japanese were known to have been increasing their efforts to develop the airdromes at Rabaul, Leh, Salamaua and Buka, as well as on Guadalcanal. To begin Task 1 without the assurance of sufficient aircraft for complete support of each succeeding operation would be dangerous, as the Japanese had discovered in the Coral Sea and Midway battles. They believed that once Task 1 had been started, it would be necessary for Tasks 2 and 3 to follow it quickly. If Rabaul, which could be strengthened by forces from Truk, were to remain in enemy hands throughout Task 1, the attacking Allied forces might be destroyed. General MacArthur and Admiral Gormley therefore recommended that the Allied forces continue to move into the New Hebrides and the Santa Cruz Islands, but that Task 1 be postponed until the South and Southwest Pacific forces were strengthened to such an extent that Tasks 1, 2, and 3 could be executed in one continuous movement. The Joint Chiefs of Staff rejected this recommendation on the 10th of July. The Japanese development of positions in the Solomons and their southward advance had to be halted immediately, regardless of the disadvantages. The British Eastern Fleet would not be able to take part, the Joint Chiefs explained, but Admiral Nimitz was sending more naval forces than had been planned originally, and Army B-17s of the 11th Bombardment Group would be sent from Hawaii to Gormley's area. In addition, the Army had decided to speed the movement of replacement aircraft to the Pacific and would do its best to follow up Task 1 with appropriate measures. Guadalcanal and Tulagi were to be invaded at once. It is clear that the Joint Chiefs and the Pacific commanders knew precisely the strategic advantages that would be gained for the Allies by the seizure of Guadalcanal and Tulagi. An immediate invasion, which would halt the advancing Japanese and secure for the Allies an advanced base from which part of the offensive operations against Rabaul could be mounted, would enable the Allies to capitalize on the victory at Midway by wresting the initiative from the Japanese. Equally clear is the fact that the Joint Chiefs realized that invading Guadalcanal and Tulagi before sufficient forces could be mustered for the advance against Rabaul would be an operation in which the margin for error would be perilously small. As Admiral King has written, because of the urgency of seizing and occupying Guadalcanal, planning was not up to the usual thorough standard. Admirals Nimitz and Gormley had begun planning in June, but the planes and men which were to make the attack were scattered from the South Pacific to California. General MacArthur's and Admiral Gormley's assertion that there were few troops available for beginning the attack was well founded. Besides the 3 divisions in Australia and the elements of the 1st Marine Division in New Zealand, there were several units in the South Pacific assigned to the defence of bases along the line of communications. 2 Army divisions were in the area. The 37th Division was in the Fijis, the Americal Division in New Caledonia. The 7th Marines, a regiment detached from the 1st Marine Division, was in Samoa. Army infantry and artillery units were at Bora Bora, the 147th Infantry, formerly of the 37th Division, was at Tongatabu. Some Army, Navy, and Marine Corps troops were holding effete in the New Hebrides, and part of the effete force was building an airfield at Espiritu Santo in the New Hebrides. The majority of the Army troops in the South Pacific had been dispatched prior to the establishment of the South Pacific area. They had been administered directly by the War Department and supplied directly by the San Francisco Port of Embarkation. The organization of the South Pacific area, the commitment of more Army Air Forces units, and the imminence of the forthcoming campaign led the War Department to organize these forces into a single command, the United States Army Forces in the South Pacific area. On the 14th of July, Major General Millard F. Harmon was appointed its commanding general with the concurrence of the Navy. Prior to his appointment as commanding general of United States Army Forces in the South Pacific, Harmon, who was one of the senior officers of the Army Air Forces and a pioneer in military aviation, had been Chief of the Air Staff. Born in 1888, he was graduated from the United States Military Academy in 1912 and entered the aviation section of the Army Signal Corps while in the Philippines. After active service in France during World War I, he attended the Army Command and General Staff School and the Army War College, taught military science and tactics at the University of Washington in Seattle, and served with various training and tactical air units until the end of 1940. In January 1941, he was sent to Britain as an air observer. Returning to the United States 4 months later, he was made a Major General in July, and in January 1942, he became Chief of the Air Staff. General Harmon, under Gormley's command, was to be responsible for the administration and supply of Army units in the South Pacific. His letter of appointment directed him to advise the area commander, but gave him no operational or tactical authority. On 26 July, he assumed his duties, with headquarters first at Auckland, and later adjacent to Gormley's at Noumea, New Caledonia. His services proved so valuable that both Admiral Gormley and his successor consulted him in the planning and execution of the Guadalcanal and subsequent South Pacific campaigns. Despite the fact that there were about 32,000 Army ground troops in the South Pacific, they could not be freely used for reinforcement of the Marines in the attack against Guadalcanal. There was not enough shipping space in the South Pacific for free movement, and the divisions holding the Fijis and New Caledonia could not be moved until replacements were available, or until the Japanese offensive threat had been eliminated. Little was then known about the objective. The Solomons are a thinly populated and undeveloped area. Lying about 800 miles east of New Guinea, the Solomons form a double chain of tropical mountainous islands extending from latitude 5 degrees south to latitude 12 degrees 30 minutes south, from northwest to southeast, and from longitude 155 degrees east to longitude 170 degrees east. They include several hundred islands, with a land area of 18,670 square miles. The largest in the northeastern chain are Buka, Bougainville, Choiseul, Santa Isabel, and Malaita. The southwestern islands consist of the Shortland, Treasury, and New Georgia groups, the Russells, Guadalcanal, Florida, San Cristobal, and Rennell. The Solomon Islands chain was divided politically. Bougainville and Buka were part of the Australian-mandated territory of New Guinea. The rest of the islands formed the British Solomon Islands Protectorate. A British district officer, responsible to the resident commissioner at Tulagi, administered civil affairs on each island in the protectorate. The resident commissioner reported to the High Commissioner for the Western Pacific in the Fijis, who in turn was responsible to the Colonial Office in London. Economic development had been slight. Lever Brothers, with local headquarters at Gavutu, had been operating fairly extensive coconut plantations since before the war, and the Burns-Philp South Seas Company, Limited, controlled island shipping. The few white residents before the war were government officials, planters, missionaries, and their families. Some, including the resident commissioner and several district officers, missionaries, and nuns, had remained in the Solomons during the Japanese occupation. The government officials, like the coast watchers, had withdrawn to the hills. The missionaries and nuns, with some exceptions, had not been molested, but had continued to operate their stations under surveillance. The native inhabitants are Melanesians of primitive culture. Noted in former years for their ferocity, they remained generally loyal to the Allied cause, and throughout the Solomons campaign assisted the coast watchers, rescued flyers and sailors, and acted as guides, scouts, and labourers. The Solomons are one of the world's wettest areas. Rainfall in some places exceeds 200 inches per year. From 1922 to 1942, annual rainfall at Tulagi averaged 164 inches. The tropical temperatures are enervating, ranging daily from 73 to 93 degrees Fahrenheit at sea level. Humidity is high. There are only two seasons, the wet and the dry. Northwest monsoons bring almost daily rain during the wet season from November to March. The term dry is relative, for southeast trade winds bring frequent rains during the dry season. There are few good harbours, but the narrow, restricted channels between the islands are usually calm. In the southern Solomons, the best anchorage is Tulagi Harbour, between Tulagi and Florida Islands. Tulagi, Gavutu, and Tanambogo Island, near Gavutu in Tulagi Harbour, all possessed some docks, jetties, and machine shops. There are few clear, flat areas suitable for airfields except on Malaita, Bougainville, New Georgia, and the grassy plain on Guadalcanal's north coast. Between Guadalcanal and Malaita lies the smaller island of Florida, formerly Ungella, which is separated from Guadalcanal by Sea Lark Channel. Reefs jut above the water to make the channel north of the centre of Guadalcanal very narrow. The waters between the southern reefs and Guadalcanal are called Lengo Channel. Those between the northern reefs and Florida are Ungella Channel. Between the southeast part of Guadalcanal and Malaita is Indispensable Strait, and at the northern end of Sea Lark Channel, between Guadalcanal and Florida, lies the small symmetrical island of Savo. By late June, Admiral Nimitz had decided to send 5 Marine air squadrons to the South Pacific to take part in the campaign. Airfield construction in the South Pacific was, therefore, to be given a high priority. As the 5 squadrons, all consisting of short-range aircraft, would have to be ferried across the Pacific on an aircraft carrier, the pilots would first have to train for carrier operations. Following Admiral Nimitz's request that more Army bombers be sent to the South Pacific, General Marshall authorized the creation of 2 mobile air forces for the Pacific Theater, one in the Southwest Pacific area and one in the Pacific Ocean areas. Each was composed of 1 B-17 heavy bombardment group. The Pacific Ocean area's mobile air force might be used anywhere within the Pacific Ocean areas at the Joint Chiefs' discretion. The 11th Heavy Bombardment Group, then in Hawaii, was selected as the Pacific Ocean Area's Mobile Air Force on the 16th of July, and within 4 days its 4 squadrons had taken off for New Caledonia. To provide more troops for the landings, Admiral King had suggested that the reinforced 2nd Marines of the 2nd Marine Division, then in California, be shipped to the South Pacific immediately. Admiral Gormley agreed, and he requested that the 2nd Marines be combat-loaded and ready for landing operations on arrival. Admiral Nimitz ordered the 2nd Marines to be ready to sail from San Diego aboard 5 ships on the 1st of July. Admiral Nimitz also decided to send the 3rd Marine Defense Battalion from Pearl Harbor to the South Pacific to provide anti-aircraft and seacoast defense of the target areas. 3 aircraft carriers, 1 battleship, and accompanying cruisers and destroyers would be available to constitute the naval supporting forces, to which would be added warships from the Southwest Pacific area. Admiral Nimitz issued his final plan for the attack on the 8th of July. He ordered the South Pacific Force, under Admiral Gormley, to capture the Santa Cruz Islands and the Tulagi-Guadalcanal area in the Solomons. As the Joint Chiefs had planned, Marines were to capture the areas. Army forces, under Admiral Gormley's direction, would then relieve the Marines. Naval forces would support these operations and construct and operate the air bases for both land-based planes and seaplanes, and Army aircraft were to operate from the bases as directed. A seaplane base, providing for 30 planes, was to be built at Tulagi. Air bases, each large enough to support 4 air squadrons, were to be built both at Guadalcanal and at Ndeni in the Santa Cruz Islands. The Navy was to be responsible for maintaining radio stations, harbour facilities, inshore patrol, port control, hospitals, underwater defences, and roads and bridges at the bases. A 60-day level of subsistence supplies and ammunition and a 90-day supply of building materials were to be maintained. The Navy was to furnish materials for the construction of airfields, bases, and harbours. The problems facing the South Pacific commanders in preparing for the invasion were tremendous, and time was short. Admiral Gormley, acting on the first orders from Admiral King before the issuance of the Joint Chiefs Directive and Admiral Nimitz's final plan, had called the commanding general of the 1st Marine Division from Wellington to his headquarters at Auckland on the 26th of June. The 1st Division commander and part of his staff began conferring with Admiral Gormley on that date, and were joined the next day by Rear Admiral John S. McCain, the commander of all Allied land-based aircraft in the South Pacific. Not all the commanders who were to take part in the operation were present. Vice Admiral Frank J. Fletcher and Rear Admiral Richmond K. Turner, who were to command the expeditionary and amphibious forces, had not then reached the South Pacific. Admiral Gormley informed the Marine officers of the plan to invade the Solomon and Santa Cruz Islands, and ordered them to prepare plans and load ships in Wellington for the invasion. Detailed planning in the South Pacific had thus been initiated prior to the issuance of the Directive on the 2nd of July. The Directive did not necessitate any basic changes in Gormley's or the Marines' concepts of the operation. Admiral Gormley issued his Operation Plan No. 142 on the 16th of July, 1942. It was to govern the execution of Task 1, which was to be divided into 3 phases. The first would be a rehearsal in the Fiji Islands. The second would be the seizure and occupation of Tulagi and Guadalcanal. The projected occupation of Ndeni and the Santa Cruz Islands would be the third and final phase. Operation Plan. No. 142 organized 2 forces, Task Forces 61 and 63. The expeditionary force of 82 ships designated as Task Force 61 was placed under the command of Admiral Fletcher. The main body of warships of Task Force 61 came from the Pacific and Atlantic fleets, while a second came from the naval forces of the Southwest Pacific. The third component assigned to Task Force 61 was the Amphibious force, which included the Marines who were to make the landings. Admiral Turner was to assume command of the South Pacific Amphibious Force on the 18th of July. The second force, Task Force 63, consisted of all the Allied land-based aircraft in the South Pacific under Admiral McCain. Analyzing the strength and capabilities of the enemy forces which Task Forces 61 and 63 were to attack, Admiral Gormley anticipated that the Japanese garrisons in the Solomons and Bismarcks might soon be reinforced. The Japanese could shuttle their aircraft between the Marshall Islands, New Britain, and the East Indies. Elements of the Fourth Fleet had already been operating in the vicinity of the Solomons and Bismarcks, and the addition of a submarine division might be expected. Rabaul was known to be a major air base, and seaplane bases were known to be in use at Gizo, Rakata Bay, Faizi, Kieta, Buka, and Gavutu. 2 planes had been based at Tulagi, 13 at Gavutu. The runway under construction at Lunga Point was not thought to have been completed. Gormley estimated that about 3,100 Japanese troops were in the Tulagi-Guadalcanal area. He believed that, of these, 1,000 special naval landing forces and pioneers were stationed on Guadalcanal at Cape Esperance, the Segilao River, Lunga Point, Tenaru, and Taivu Point on the north coast. It was assumed that there were at least 6 anti-aircraft guns at both Lunga Point and Kukum, with more at Taivu Point to the east. Gormley considered, correctly, that the south coast was not held in any strength. After assembling and rehearsing in the Fijis, the expeditionary force, Task Force 61 was to capture and occupy Tulagi and nearby areas, including that part of Guadalcanal most suitable for the construction of airfields. The tentative date for D-Day set by the Joint Chiefs of Staff, 1st August, could not be met. On the 16th of July, Gormley notified Admiral Nimitz that the late arrival of the 1st Marine Division's 2nd Echelon at Wellington, New Zealand, coupled with the delay in loading caused by bad weather in Wellington, would necessitate postponing the target date until the 7th of August. The date could not be postponed further, however, lest the Japanese complete their airstrip for use against the Allied forces. Once Tulagi and the landing field on Guadalcanal had been taken, the expeditionary force would occupy Ndeni, and troops were to be ready to work on airfields on Guadalcanal and Ndeni immediately. Airfield construction materiel and troops would be sent forward as soon as possible. To free the amphibious force for further offensive action, occupation troops were to be dispatched to relieve the Marines. Operation Plan. Number 1-42 did not specifically designate the forces to effect the relief and occupation, but stated that orders would be issued at a later date. The land-based aircraft of Task Force 63 were to support and cover the movements of the expeditionary force, arrange special missions at the request of Task Force 61, and carry out their regular scouting missions. Task Force 63 was to cover the amphibious force's approach to Tulagi and Guadalcanal and the landing there, as well as to execute air attacks by arrangement with Task Force 61. Amphibious patrol bombers were to patrol temporarily from Ndeni, which had not been occupied by the Japanese, by D-1, and additional patrol planes would scout from the east coast of Malaita on D+1. After the conclusion of the Guadalcanal phase, Task Force 63 would cover the occupation of Ndeni by the landing force. Admiral Gormley, announcing his intention to proceed from Auckland to Noumea aboard his flagship Argonne about D-5, stated that he would arrange a conference between representatives of the commanders of the expeditionary and amphibious forces and of the South Pacific land-based aircraft to settle the final details of air support and to coordinate the various air efforts. The commander of Task Force 63 was also ordered to arrange for air scouting by Southwest Pacific Air Forces. Logistical plans for the operation took into account the lack of good bases in the South Pacific area. During the rehearsal, all vessels were to take on fuel as the tactical situation permitted from tankers at Noumea and the Fijis, and from tanks on shore in the Fijis and Espiritu Santo and Efate in the New Hebrides. Fleet units were to take on full loads of ammunition after the rehearsal. Only minor ship repairs could be effected in the South Pacific. Auckland had a dockyard and a dry dock, and a floating dry dock at Wellington could accommodate a heavy cruiser. In addition, the repair ship Whitney was stationed at Tongatabu, and a salvage tug was to be stationed initially at Espiritu Santo. For major repairs, heavy fleet units would have to go to Pearl Harbor. Fleet units would carry sufficient provisions to be self-sustaining, while the amphibious force would embark 60 days' supply and 10 units of fire for the Marines. Fresh foods would be supplied to the amphibious force if enough ships were available. Once they were unloaded, ships of the amphibious force were to leave the Solomon and Santa Cruz Islands and return to Noumea unless directed elsewhere, and would be escorted by warships assigned by Admiral Fletcher. Returning ships would carry American wounded to the hospital ship Solace at Noumea, which would either retain the wounded on board or distribute them among the army hospitals at Noumea and the Fijis, or take them to the Naval Base Hospital at Auckland. Toward the end of July, when Admiral McCain's tactical plan for Task Force 63 was completed, South Pacific air strength had increased and the air bases had been improved. 2 companies of the 182nd Infantry and 1 engineer company of the Americal Division had occupied Efate in the New Hebrides on the 18th of March to build an airfield. Marine Corps and naval personnel followed these forces, until by May there were 7,500 on the island. On 28 May, 500 men of the Efate garrison had occupied Espiritu Santo, 145 miles to the north. Admiral Gormley had ordered the construction of a bomber strip on Espiritu Santo to be completed by the 28th of July, in time to support the invasion of the Solomons. B-17s of the 11th Heavy Bombardment Group arrived in the area during July. The 98th Squadron landed in New Caledonia on 22nd July, followed by the 42nd the next day. The 431st Squadron landed in the Fijis on 24th July, and the 26th landed at Efate on 25th July. By the end of July, Task Force 63 consisted of 291 aircraft of various types, based on New Caledonia, the Fijis, Tonga Tabu, Samoa, and Efate, and assigned to the defense of those islands. Of the 291 planes, 31 Navy patrol bombers, PBYs, were based on New Caledonia and the Fijis. 93 naval fighters were based on Efate, New Caledonia, the Fijis, Tonga Tabu, and Samoa. 25 naval observation planes were operating from Efate, New Caledonia, Tonga Tabu, and Samoa, and 17 Navy scout bombers, SBDs, were based in Samoa. 95 Army planes were in Task Force 63. 35 Army B-17s and 22 B-26s were stationed at New Caledonia and the Fijis. 38 Army Pagos were also operating from New Caledonia. 9 Vincents, 18 Hudsons, and 3 Singapores of the Royal New Zealand Air Force were based on New Caledonia and the Fijis. Admiral McCain issued his orders on the 25th of July. He divided Task Force 63 into 7 task groups. One group, consisting of the 69th Army Bombardment Squadron, the 67th Army Fighter Squadron, a New Zealand Air Force Hudson Squadron, and 2 PBYs, was to scout over 400-mile sectors from New Caledonia. A second group, consisting of the 11th Army Heavy Bombardment Group, to be based on New Caledonia, Efate, Espiritu Santo, and the Fijis, was to scout between New Caledonia and the Solomons, and over and west of the Solomons. It was this group which carried out bombing attacks on Guadalcanal and Tulagi prior to D-Day. The third group, consisting of the seaplane tender Curtis and attached patrol planes, was to move part of its patrol planes to Espiritu Santo. Beginning on D-2, the planes based in Espiritu Santo were to search both east and west of the Solomons, while the remaining patrol planes moved from Noumea to Ndeni and Espiritu Santo. The fourth group, composed of the seaplane tender McFarland and attached patrol bombers, was to move to Ndeni to inaugurate the air searches northeast of the Solomons on D-1. The fifth, composed of the seaplane tender Mackinac and attached patrol planes, was to proceed to the east coast of Malaita on D-3. The sixth group, consisting of Marine Fighting Squadron 212 and Scouting Squadron D-14, was to send 3 scouts to Espiritu Santo and to aid the bombardment effort from Efate. The final group, consisting of Marine Observation Squadron 251, was to assist the bombardment effort from Espiritu Santo. The air searches of Task Force 63 would thus cover the general area between New Caledonia and the Solomons, over the Solomons, east to Ndeni, and south to the Fijis. General MacArthur agreed to have Southwest Pacific Air Forces patrol the northern and western approaches to the Solomons during Task 1. Prior to D-5, Southwest Pacific Air Forces were to reconnoitre over eastern New Guinea, Lorengau, Kavieng, Buka, Ontong Java, and Tulagi. Thereafter, no Southwest Pacific planes were to fly east of longitude 158 degrees 15 minutes. East, a line just west of Guadalcanal and east of New Georgia, Choiseul and Bougainville in the Solomons group, and latitude 15 degrees south unless requested by Gormley. From D-5 to D+4, Southwest Pacific aircraft were to conduct daily reconnaissance flights over eastern New Guinea, Kavieng, and the easternmost point of New Georgia, and combat aircraft were to be ready to strike any Japanese naval vessels within a 550-mile radius of Port Moresby. From D-Day to D+4, when the transports and cargo ships of the Amphibious force would be unloading at Guadalcanal and Tulagi, Allied aircraft would thus be interdicting Japanese aerial operations in the Rabaul-Kavieng area. At the same time, Buka was to be attacked to prevent the Japanese from refueling there. During this critical period, short-range aircraft were to attack Lae and Salamaua periodically to prevent those bases from sending aircraft to reinforce Rabaul. The Expeditionary Force Commander, Admiral Fletcher, issued his Operation Order No. 142 to Task Force 61 on 28 July. Task Force 61 was divided into two groups, the Air Support Force and the Amphibious Force. The Air Support Force, under the command of Rear Admiral Lee Noyes, consisted of 26 warships and 5 tankers. This group was subdivided into 3 units, each built around an aircraft carrier. The first included the Saratoga, 2 heavy cruisers, and 5 destroyers. The carrier Enterprise, the battleship North Carolina, 1 heavy cruiser, 1 light anti-aircraft cruiser, and 5 destroyers constituted another unit. The third unit was composed of the carrier Wasp, 2 heavy cruisers, 6 destroyers, and 5 tankers. The Amphibious Force, under the command of Admiral Turner, consisted of 23 transports and 28 warships. Turner's force was composed of the South Pacific Amphibious Force, the naval forces from the Southwest Pacific, and 3 heavy cruisers, 1 light anti-aircraft cruiser, and 6 destroyers from the Central Pacific. The Amphibious Force was to sail from the Fijis to a point about 400 nautical miles south of the west tip of Guadalcanal, and then to sail north at 12 knots toward the objectives. This course would keep the force well away from Japanese-held islands until time for the attack. As the Amphibious Force would be landing its troops on islands which lay beyond range of fighter planes from the nearest Allied bases, it was to receive tactical air support directly from the Air Support Force, which would also execute necessary aerial reconnaissance. It was apparently Fletcher's intention to withdraw the carriers prior to D+3, somewhat short of the time required for the Amphibious Force to unload its ships completely. Admiral Gormley was aware of this intention. Emphasizing the need for continuous air cover over the target area, he stated that if the airfield at Guadalcanal was operational, he intended to base their squadrons from the carriers. These squadrons would then be relieved by land-based fighters sent in from Efate with extra gasoline tanks. But Admiral McCain pointed out that 10 days would be required to fit the extra tanks to the Navy F-4F fighters. The advancing Amphibious Force was to be further protected by submarines operating in the vicinity of major Japanese bases. 5 submarines of the Pacific Fleet were to cover the Truk area from 22nd July to 20th August, while submarines from the Southwest Pacific were to patrol the waters near Rabaul. Admiral Gormley's plan provided that, on the withdrawal of the Air Support Force, the Amphibious Force was to secure air support from Task Force 63. It should be noted, however, that the distances separating Espiritu Santo and Efate from Guadalcanal would prevent Task Force 63 from providing fighter cover for the Marines on Guadalcanal until the airfield there could be developed enough to serve as a base. The Amphibious Force was to furnish escorts for its transports returning to Noumea after unloading. Damaged ships were authorized to return either to Noumea or to put into other convenient friendly ports. Like General Harmon, the officer assigned to command the Amphibious Force, Rear Admiral Richmond K. Turner, was also an aviator, but he had taken up flying at a comparatively late date. In 1908, when Turner was graduated from the United States Naval Academy as a passed midshipman, he held 5th place in a class of 201. Commissioned an ensign in 1910, he studied naval ordnance and engineering in the years prior to World War I. During the war, he was a gunnery officer aboard several battleships, and in 1925 and 1926, he was on duty with the Navy Bureau of Ordnance. He completed naval aviation pilot training at Pensacola in August 1927 and commanded air squadrons for nearly 2 years. From 1929 to 1931, he served in the Plans Division of the Bureau of Aeronautics, and in 1932 he was a technical advisor to the United States delegation at the General Disarmament Conference at Geneva. He then served aboard the carrier Saratoga, and after graduation from the Naval War College in 1936, he served on the staff there for 2 years. In 1939, he commanded the cruiser Astoria when she carried the remains of, Ambassador Hiroshi Saito to Japan. In 1940, Turner became director of the War Plans Division of the Office of the Chief of Naval Operations, and in early 1942, a change in the organization of the Office of Naval Operations gave him the title of Assistant Chief of Staff to the Commander-in-Chief of the United States Fleet. He held that post, which was also concerned with war plans, until he was ordered to the Pacific in the summer of 1942, at the age of 57. Admiral Turner, who after conferring with Admiral Nimitz at Pearl Harbor had reached Wellington on the 15th of July, issued Operation Plan Number A3-42 to the Amphibious Force on the 30th of July. He divided his force into 8 groups: Transport Group X, Transport Group Y, the Guadalcanal Fire Support Group, the Tulagi Fire Support Group, the Minesweeper Group, the Screening Group, the Air Support Group, and the Landing Force Group, which consisted of the 1st Marine Division, reinforced, less the 7th Marines. Transport Group X, assigned to the Guadalcanal landing, consisted of 4 transport divisions. 2 of the divisions were each composed of 3 transports and 1 cargo ship, the 3rd of 2 transports and 1 cargo ship, and the 4th of 1 transport and 3 cargo ships. Transport Group Y, assigned to the landings in the Tulagi area, consisted of 2 transport divisions, one made up of 4 transports and the other of 4 destroyers previously converted to troop carriers, APDs. 4 more ships, the Xylin and the Betelgeuse and their escorting destroyers, were to transport the 3rd Defense Battalion from Pearl Harbor. The Guadalcanal Fire Support Group consisted of 3 fire sections composed of 1 heavy cruiser and 2 observation planes each, and of 2 fire sections of 2 destroyers each. The Tulagi Fire Support Group consisted of 1 light anti-aircraft cruiser and 2 destroyers. There were 5 minesweepers in the minesweeping group. The Amphibious Force's second-in-command, Rear Admiral V.A.C. Crutchley, R.N., commanded the screening group. It consisted of 3 Australian cruisers, 1 United States heavy cruiser, and 9 destroyers, 2 fighter squadrons based on the aircraft carriers, but detached to the screening group on D-Day, and 8 observation seaplanes from the cruisers. The air support group was made up of 1 fighter and 1 dive bomber squadron, plus 1 additional fighter and 1 additional dive bomber squadron for the initial mission, all drawn from the carriers. The landing force was led by the commanding general of the 1st Marine Division. It was divided into 2 groups, the Guadalcanal group directly under the division commander, and the Northern group under the assistant division commander. 6 observation planes from the cruisers Astoria and Quincy were assigned to the Guadalcanal group, and 2 planes from the cruiser Vincennes were assigned to the Northern group. Admiral Turner, in his analysis of enemy strength against which the amphibious force would have to contend, estimated that at least 150 Japanese planes were based in the Bismarck, New Guinea area, and that 11 Japanese cruisers, 13 destroyers, 15 submarines, 12 patrol bombers, 15 or 17 transports, and a number of motor torpedo boats were available. The amphibious force was to expect attacks by the planes based at fields from Rabaul to Salamaua. Admiral Turner warned his force that submarines, motor torpedo boats, cruisers, destroyers, and transports might be met around Tulagi. The Guadalcanal Tulagi garrison was estimated to total 7,125, a figure more than double Gormley's. It was believed that 1,850 men constituted Tulagi's garrison, whose armament included anti-aircraft and coast defense guns, seaplanes, and picket boats. The rest of the troops were supposed to be in the Lunga area on Guadalcanal, which was protected by anti-aircraft and coast defense guns. The amphibious force was to assume attack dispositions on D-1 and to arrive in the transport areas off Guadalcanal and Tulagi before sunrise of D-Day. The main landings were to be made on the center of the south coast of Tulagi and on a 1,600-yard-long sandy beach between the Tenaru and Tenavatu rivers on the north coast of Guadalcanal, about 6,000 yards east of Lunga Point. H-hour, the time of the Tulagi landing, was set for 8 o'clock for planning purposes. 0 hour, The time of the Guadalcanal landing was originally set for 8:30 a.m. Admiral Turner's flagship, the cargo ship Macaulay, was the site of the 1st Marine Division's floating command post. Admiral Crutchley flew his flag aboard the Australia. The majority of the Amphibious Force, Transport Group X, the Guadalcanal Fire Support Group, 1 fighter squadron and 1 dive bomber squadron, and about 2 regimental combat teams of the 1st Marine Division, was assigned to the attack on Guadalcanal. Transport Group Y, the Tulagi Fire Support Group, 1 fighter squadron, 1 dive bomber squadron, and the balance of the Marine Division, except the reserve, were assigned to the northern attack. Air attacks by the planes directly supporting the amphibious force were to inaugurate operations on D-Day. Communication and control between the amphibious force and the air squadrons were to be effected through an air support director group from the carrier force stationed aboard the Macaulay. An alternate director group was to be aboard the Neville. 15 minutes before sunrise of D-Day, while the transports were approaching their unloading areas, 1 fighter squadron was to destroy any aircraft at Lunga or Coley points on Guadalcanal, and any seaplanes, motor torpedo boats or submarines operating near the island's north coast. At the same time, a 2nd fighter squadron would strike similar targets near Tulagi. 2 dive bomber squadrons, assisted by the fighters, were to hit anti-aircraft and coast defense guns on Guadalcanal, Tulagi, and Gavutu. Dive bombers were also to cover the attacking landing craft as they moved toward the beaches. Beginning 1 hour after sunrise on D-Day, fighters and dive bombers were to maintain stations overhead to protect the transports. Admiral Turner ordered the fire support warships to fire at all anti-aircraft and coast defense guns, to cover the minesweepers, and to be on the alert against torpedo boats and submarines. Warships were to take care to avoid interfering with landing craft formations, and for the safety of the American troops were to use percussion instead of time fuses against shore targets. The warships were to provide naval gunfire liaison teams, equipped with radios, to go ashore with the troops. The naval gunfire support problem in the Tulagi area was more complicated than that for Guadalcanal. Numerous. Nearby islets and promontories of Florida Island lie within artillery and even small arms range of Tulagi. The ship's gunfire plan called for supporting fires to be placed prior to the landings on all the islets as well as on parts of Florida and on Tulagi. The ships were also to put fire on the radio station on the southeastern part of Tulagi and on Tulagi's anti-aircraft positions. Starting at H+30 minutes, the party on shore was to designate targets. The Tulagi Fire Support Group and the air squadrons were also to bombard the southeast portion of Tulagi when the troops, advancing southeast from the landing beach, had reached the first phase line, about 2/3 of the way down the island. The signal from the troops for this bombardment would be a green star cluster flare. The cruisers of the Guadalcanal Fire Support Group were to cover the area between Lunga and Coley points with fire starting at daylight of D-Day. The 4 destroyers were to take stations at 0-30 minutes to serve as control and salvage vessels by the landing beach. They were to mark the line of departure for the initial boat waves 5,000 yards north of the beach. All ships of the group were to close in by 0-10 minutes to give direct support to the landing. From 0-10 to 0-5 minutes, they were to put fire to a depth of 200 yards on an area extending 800 yards on either side of the beach, using 135 8-inch and 1,400 5-inch rounds. Starting at 0+5 minutes, the ships were to put fire ashore to assist the advance of the combat teams from the landing beach west to the Lunga airfield. The liaison planes assigned to the landing forces were to mark the flanks of the beaches with smoke at H-20 and 0-20 minutes, respectively. Starting at H+1 hour, 1 plane was to assume station over Guadalcanal for observation duty for the field artillery. If ground-to-air radio communication failed, communications between the ground forces and the liaison planes were to be maintained by message drops and ground panel codes. Transport Groups X and Y were to land the troops, equipment, and supplies of the 1st Marine Division on Tulagi and Guadalcanal in accordance with that division's plans. The destroyer transports of Group X would act as control and salvage vessels for the boats landing at Tulagi. The minesweepers were to sweep the shallows south of Tulagi from H to H plus 1.5 hours. 3 minesweepers were then to sweep the waters from the Guadalcanal landing beach east to Taivu Point, while 2 cleared the area off the beach itself. The transport group commanders were authorized to move their ships in close to the landing beaches once the waters were proved safe. On D+1, the minesweepers would clear the Kukum Beach area just west of Lunga Point. The screening group would guard the amphibious force against surface, air, and submarine attacks. 1 fighter squadron was to cover the transport areas during daylight while the ships were unloading. Control would be exercised through a fighter director group from the carrier forces aboard the Chicago. During enemy air attacks, the fire support warships would come under Admiral Crutchley's control to screen the transports with anti-aircraft fire and, in the event of surface attack, would also support the screening group. On the completion of their shorefire missions, the fire support warships were to pass to Admiral Crutchley's command. During the amphibious phase, 1 observation plane from the Vincennes was to conduct anti-submarine patrols, reporting results to the screening group. Admiral Turner intended to establish amphibious force headquarters ashore once the objectives had been captured and the amphibious phase ended. Communications with the area commander would be maintained through the 1st Marine Division's radio. A small naval force, including a boat repair section, boat crews, and 12 landing craft, mechanized. 20 landing craft personnel, large, landing craft, personnel and 30 landing craft, vehicle, was to be established at Guadalcanal and Tulagi. It was estimated that the transports would be unloaded and could withdraw from the forward area by the night of D+1. They were to retire under the command of Rear Admiral Norman Scott, the commander of the Tulagi Fire Support Group. The cargo ships were to be unloaded by D+4 and were to retire under command of Admiral Crutchley. The force for the Santa Cruz operation, consisting of 1 cruiser, 4 destroyers, 4 transports, 1 cargo ship, and the 2nd Marines, reinforced, having formed an integral part of the amphibious force for the Guadalcanal-Tulagi invasion, was to depart from the Guadalcanal area about D-Day to occupy and defend Ndeni. On completion of the entire operation, the air squadrons were to revert to Task Force 61. The amphibious force organized for the invasions was to be dissolved on orders from Admiral Fletcher, but the South Pacific Amphibious Force proper would remain in existence.